And the symposium begins with a presentation by Igor Shoikhedbrod. Igor is assistant professor at the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto. As said previously by Johan, in 2019, Igor published the book Revisiting Marx's Critique of Liberalism, Rethinking Justice, Legality and Rights. The book engages with the question of whether Marxists can believe in human rights, and this is a question which has been questioned by many different scholars. But in the book and in several articles, Igor has completed a substantial analysis on textual basis about the issue of rights in the earth of Marx as such. Moreover, Igor displays not only that the Marxist can in fact believe in human rights, he also displays that the Marxist perspective has a number of strengths as compared to other contemporary political theorists such as Nancy Fraser, Axel Honneth, Jürgen Habermas and John Rawls, among others. After the presentation by Igor, Jessica Whyte will offer her comments. Should we have time still, we may also invite the other panelists to comment. Thus, I leave the word to you, Igor, please.
Okay. Let me just share my screen here. Okay, I hope everyone can see that, just to make sure we're on the same page or slide. First and foremost, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me here. It really is an honor and a pleasure to be joined by such distinguished scholars of human rights. And I'm basically here to learn from everyone else, just to put it lightly. As was said, I teach at the University of Toronto, and to that extent, I'm represented by the University of Toronto Faculty Association. Now, this symposium is about human rights, and I think it would be morally irresponsible if I didn't comment on the ongoing scandal at the University of Toronto having to do with the directorship of the Human Rights Program at the Faculty of Law. So I support UTFA, that's University of Toronto Faculty Association's support for the Canadian Association of University Teachers, their censuring of the University of Toronto for this ongoing scandal. And I wanted to be very clear on this. Okay, so now that I've made that statement, I'd like to begin this presentation. I apologize in advance if I don't look as awake as I should be because of the time difference, so bear with me. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Let's see here. Okay, so I thought it'd be a good idea to put things into perspective, into historical perspective, to get a sense of this debate about Marxism and human rights. And there are many more names to add, including many of the scholars and the panelists here. But what I've tried to do is to at least list some of the scholars who have been very prominent in this debate. And for whom it wasn't only a theoretical debate, but also a question of life and death, beginning with the first thinker, a Soviet compatriot, as it were, who wrote The General Theory of Law and Marxism, 1924. This is, you could say, the heat of the Russian Revolution. This is Yevgeny Pashukhanis, of course, and he was, in my view, one of those most brilliant and original Marxist theorists of law. And he put forward this theory, the general theory of law in Marxism, which is known as the commodity exchange theory of law. And ultimately, the argument is that the legal form would wither away once the commodity form withers away. And legal form for Pashukhanis encompassed not only the idea of law, but most importantly, the idea of the juridical person, the bearer of rights. Okay, so Pashukhanis, working with what he thought to be Marx's key conceptual laboratory in Capital, developed this idea of the commodity form to show how it's linked with the legal form. And I could say, in this sense, that within the Marxist tradition, the thinker who was perhaps most critical of the idea of human rights as representing, I should say, the egotistical individual of bourgeois capitalist society is none other than Yevgeny Pashukhanis, who looked forward to the withering away of law, of rights, and their replacement with technical regulation and unity of social purpose. But what's fascinating, of course, is that it's not only Pashukanis who shared this view. Many liberal, left liberal and egalitarian theorists also shared Pashukanis' view and attributed it to Marx. One such thinker comes to mind, Stephen Lukes, in a famous article, Praxis International, Can a Marxist Believe in Human Rights? The short answer is no, but that doesn't stop Marxists from participating in the struggle for expanding the horizon of rights. So on theoretical grounds, it would be inconsistent for Marxists to believe in human rights, but that shouldn't stop Marxists from doing just that, as Marxists have and continue to believe in human rights and expand the scope of freedom through rights and legal struggles. Another commentator wrote a book, Alan Buchanan has written about human rights as well, a famous book, Marx and Justice, the Radical Critique of Liberalism. Here we have another invention, as it were, really influenced by Rawls, John Rawls, and Hume's Circumstances of Justice, which ultimately argue that Marx's conception of communism was beyond justice. And why is that the case? Well, because it supersedes the so-called circumstances of justice, and those are material scarcity and limited benevolence. Both of those are overcome in the communist society of the future, as far as Buchanan was concerned. Then we have a Marxist, an erudite Marxist turned vociferous ex-Marxist, Leszek Kolakowski, who's well known for his three-volume work, Main Currents of Marxism, also wrote a very important article called Marxism and Human Rights in 1983. And there, what Kolakowski says is that there is no philosophic basis for human rights in Marx's account, in Marx's social theory or social philosophy. And the reason for that is because there's no role or room for the separate individual, the individual who's not swallowed up by the community or the polis, as it were. And that ultimately links to the totalitarian culmination of Marxism in practice, the Soviet experiment for Kolakowski. But of course, and this is an important point to make here, is that the Marxist tradition, just like the liberal tradition and many other traditions, is internally diverse. And there isn't just one approach within this tradition, and that's always been the case, and it continues to be the case. So it's important to demonstrate, in my view, or at least to show that there was always a countercurrent within the Marxist tradition that didn't accept any of these interpretations. Perhaps the most famous among these Marxists, heretic, is Ernst Bloch in his book Natural and Human Dignity, which was published in 1961 in German, translated in English in 1986. And there, the fascinating part about Bloch is, of course, he lived through the worst, you could say, of both capitalist society, including Nazism, and actually existing socialist society, and never gave up the idea of the upright gate, and thought that Marxism would be consistent with that, the warm current of Marxism. So he certainly didn't think that Marxism was opposed to human rights, or at least a certain understanding of it, connected to dignity, but a very radical one, a critique of domination. Then there is the Praxis school, Yugoslav-based Praxis school. And of course, there's a dark cloud in its legacy, and we can get into that a bit later. But as far as this Praxis school was concerned, they, of course, came up with this, you could say, a statement of purpose, the philosophic foundation of human rights, which they published in 1981, which actually provides a Marxian argument, drawing mainly on Marx's early writings, humanistic writings, that provides a basis for human rights within this tradition of humanistic Marxism. What's always fascinated me about the work, this early work of the Praxis school, is they always went to great lengths to show that it is a fundamental mistake to simply dismiss human rights as ideology, particularly for societies, state socialist societies that haven't even achieved what they claim to be formal bourgeois rights that amount to ideology. And I've always found that fascinating because if, and this is Zizek said something similar, if rights were so formal and empty, why were the authorities so worried in no society about these formal rights? So this is something we can perhaps discuss during the discussion phase. Others, like Amy Bartholomew in the Socialist Register, return to the question that Lukes put forward. And there, the question is, regardless of what Marx thought, what should Marxists think when it comes to the struggle over rights? And of course, Bartholomew thought that the Marxists should work within this terrain and struggle within this terrain. And more recently, of course, the work of Susan Marx, False Tree of Liberty, Human Rights and Radical Thought, tries to excavate the radical tradition. And I mean, I'm more interested in learning about these new interventions and looking forward to the discussion today. Finally, I think it's important to note that Daniel Ben Said, in his work, in his later work, in The Dispossessed, which by the way was just translated by Robert Nichols in English, and I highly recommend it, a plug for this book. And why is this important? Well, because Ben Said returns to Marx's reflections on the debates on the law of thefts of wood, and shows that it was never a hostile, right, approach to rights, but rather the question of right against right, an antinomy of rights, and that there is this continuity, okay, from Marx's really early writings to what he does in Capital and other works. So it wasn't simply a dismissal of rights, but rather the struggle over rights and different conception of rights. And so this is just a map, of the debate. And of course, the speakers here will have a lot more to add to this debate, this ongoing debate. But my approach, in any case, to Marx and human rights, and this presentation, my talk will mostly focus on Marx rather than the Marxist tradition as such, um, tries to orient itself around Marx's critique of liberalism. Now, liberalism, as I tried to mention, just as like Marxism, is internally diverse. So there's classical liberalism, there's social liberalism, there's libertarianism, there's neoliberalism, right? And the list goes on. But we have to look at roots, right? And liberalism has something to do with liberalis, which pertains to a free people. Now, within the liberal tradition, this is where the question of rights comes in. It's the freedom and moral equality of individuals, this idea that these should be protected primarily through the device of rights. That tends to extend across the board within this liberal tradition. Now, if we want to understand Marx's critique of liberalism, we have to distinguish his critique of liberalism from other critiques of liberalism. And those include conservative, and you could say, depends on your interpretation of these thinkers, those on the far right, right, or who inspired the far right. Their critique of liberalism is very different than Marx's, and I want to show why this matters. If we take Friedrich Nietzsche, for example, for him, liberalism, right, is decadent. It leads to the last man. Anywhere you look, the creature of equal rights, creature comforts, and reproduces the specter of nihilism. It's gone too far in the egalitarian direction. Nietzsche was fundamentally inegalitarian. Right? That's what the idea of an Übermensch is all about. There can't be an Übermensch if people are fundamentally equal, more as far as morality is concerned, moral personhood. Martin Heidegger, who was influenced and wrote a book about Nietzsche, he also had a root and branch critique of liberalism, the idea of being divorced from Dasein, being, right, and this technological inframing. Carl Schmitt, who was also another character who was, rather dark in his association with the Nazis and also his defense. He too was a critic of liberalism, we shouldn't forget. And the emphasis there is the chronic indeterminacy that's produced inevitably by liberalism, and it can't deal with this chronic indeterminacy and this idea of the state of exception. Now, of course, this isn't to say that left-wing critics haven't appropriated some of these thinkers for their own purposes, but there are limits to that because the fundamental basis of these critiques of liberalism are actually quite reactionary in character. So you can only push these thinkers to a certain extent, and it's important to realize that. Now, it's important also to see how Marx's critique of liberalism differs fundamentally from those of Schmitt, Heidegger, and Nietzsche. For Marx, at least classical liberalism has failed to deliver on its emancipatory project, and it will continue to fail as long as capitalist property relations and class domination remain firmly intact. And this reminds me, so what's the solution? The solution is a democracy. As early as 1843, in his critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, the introduction, which was published, democracy is the solved riddle of all constitutions. And we'll see at some point in time, when it comes to the relationship between democracy and liberalism, liberalism will want to tame and constrain democracy, while Marx will want to expand and push it to its logical conclusion. And that's where we'll find the decisive difference between Marxism, or Marx, I should say, and liberalism. Liberalism says we should stop at a certain point, especially when it comes to private property. And Marx says, no, we have to push it forward to its logical conclusion in order to achieve human emancipation. All right. So here are three selfies, as Terrell Carver puts it, of Karl Marx, the very young Marx, the middle Marx, and the old Marx. And what I want to do is to show you that his relationship to liberalism was never one that was dismissive and simply hostile. And this is evident as early as 1842, when he was this radical liberal himself, as editor-in-chief of the Rheinische Zeitung, where he talks about um, his orientation towards liberalism and liberals. And here's a passage: "We arouse the resentment of many, indeed the majority of free-thinking practical people who have undertaken the laborious task of winning freedom step by step within the constitutional framework, while we, from our comfortable armchair of abstractions, shows them their contradictions." So notice there's a sense in which Marx, at this really early age, as this young, radical, you could say liberal journalist, notices both a virtue in liberalism, but also its limitations, right? But not one that's dismissive in any meaningful sense of the word. And that's going to be important, because this dimension, Marx basically realizing the extent to which liberalism can contribute, practical liberalism can contribute to the enhancement of liberty. He doesn't dismiss that part, but he will also be interested in showing the contradictions. And of course, in these early writings for the Rheinische Zeitung, I can get into the contextual details later on if you'd like, but in these early writings, Marx doesn't have any issue invoking the idea of rational right or defending freedom of the press, as you can see in the first passage here, or for that matter, defending a customary right of the poor, the impoverished Rhenish peasants from gathering fallen forest wood, a right of necessity, against the right of private property, even before he was a Marxist, quote unquote. So here there is no problem as far as most of the commentators are concerned, but they say, well, this isn't Marx. This is an early Hegelian idealist, liberal Marx. But you know what the fascinating part is, and the challenge to that kind of dismissive interpretation of this isn't Marx. He wanted to republish these early writings in 1851, when he was no longer the idealist, Marx with the eyes, looking up, but they're looking squarely at the ground. So he wasn't embarrassed by these views, and in fact published them, wanted to publish them in any case, in the heat, you could say, of the reactionary restoration period in Prussia. So that's an important point. There is continuity. There isn't an epistemological break, but there is a different orientation, an intellectual development that takes place vis-a-vis rights. And of course, it wouldn't be a complete discussion about Marx and rights if we don't talk about the Judenfrage, or on the Jewish question, which in my view, a big issue is that it's almost always this work, the origin of this work is completely decontextualized. It's treated as this canonical text in political theory. Maybe it is, I'm not going to debate that, but it was written in a particular context. One doesn't just decide to write an essay, an article on the Jewish question. It's written in response to something else. And in fact, there's a political background here. Marx was visited by the leadership of the Jewish community in the Rhineland and was asked to endorse a petition for equal rights for the Jewish community, which he says he's willing to do. So let me read this here, share it with everyone present. So just to think about the context around the Jewish question, the work that's referenced for Marx's dismissal and hostility towards rights. So let's look at the context. Here's the context. He says the following in 1843, a letter to Ruger, who was then the collaborator in the Deutsche Französische Jahrbucher, whereon the Jewish question was published. I have just been visited by the chief of the Jewish community here, who has asked me for a petition for the Jews to the provincial assembly, and I'm willing to do it. However much I dislike the Jewish faith, And this is, of course, a problem in Marx's work. We can get into that too. Bauer's view, Bruno Bauer's view, seems to me too abstract. Now, here's the relevant point about rights. The thing is to make as many breaches as possible in the Christian state, the Prussian state, and to smuggle in as much as we can of what is rational. And rational for Marx, as for Hegel, freedom enabling, expansive. At least it must be attempted. And the embitterment grows with every petition that is rejected with protestations. So the struggle for equal rights by the Jewish community is a rational struggle. And so what becomes on the Jewish question, right, is an attempt to actually defend the equal rights of Jews in a society that has excluded them from political participation, but also from civil rights. And Marx is going to be very fierce in defending these rights for the Jewish community. The problem, of course, is that the second essay, where he uses very problematic language, is almost always substituted for the whole point behind on the Jewish question, which is to defend the equal rights of Jews against those like Bauer, for whom Christians were a step ahead of the Jews as far as emancipation was concerned. So Marx will show actually that religious conscience is not a barrier to be granted equal rights, right? And he points to the United States to show that actually religion continues to exist and is vigorous, right? So there's no way in which Judaism is an obstacle to being granted equal rights. Now that tends to be forgotten for some reason or another. And everyone focuses not only on the problematic language that Marx uses in the second essay in particular, second part of the essay, pardon me, but also his critique of the so-called rights of man. But let's get into that. Let's talk about that critique. Let's take it head on. The way of approaching it, as far as I'm concerned, since ultimately the work is focused on defending the equal rights of Jews, is to look at the potential and the limitations of of political emancipation as it pertains to human emancipation. This is still Marx, we can argue, in this pre-Marxist period. Fair enough. So what does he tell us about political emancipation, the idea of being granted equal rights in a politically emancipated state? He tells us political emancipation, quote, certainly represents a great progress. It is not indeed the final form of human emancipation, but it is the final form of human emancipation within the prevailing social order. Okay, so it represents progress, but it's not the whole story. What is the society or the social order that he's talking about? Bourgeois society. Eventually he'll call it capitalist society. Now, there is an issue that Marx has, and here he's speaking to the liberals. He calls them the political liberators. The political liberators, he says, reduce citizenship, the political community, to a mere means for preserving the so-called rights of man, and consequently the citizen is declared to be the servant of egoistic man. So he draws on a distinction between two categories of rights, the rights of the citizen and the so-called rights of man. The rights of citizens he leaves unscathed, but he leaves the criticism for the rights, so-called rights of man. What are those so-called rights of man? Liberté, égalité, you could say property, security, right? And then the conclusion ultimately is that none of these so-called or supposed rights of man that I just mentioned, therefore, go beyond the egoistic man. So they don't go beyond the egoistic man, as he is a member of civil society, that is, an individual separated from the community, withdrawn into himself, wholly preoccupied with his private caprice. Some interpreters, like Fred Neuhauser and Jay Bernstein, what they tend to do is to say, yeah, so Marx defends the rights of the citizen, but completely criticizes and dismisses the so-called rights of man. At least on the surface, that seems to be the case. But as I'll try to show later on, there's a problem with this interpretation. Because if Marx doesn't endorse the very idea of the juridical person who is a bearer of rights, there can't be a society that is fully emancipated. Because political emancipation is a precondition for human emancipation, not a barrier to it. So hopefully we'll be able to debate this point in further detail, but I think that's where the confusion arises. What is the relationship between political emancipation and human emancipation? Certainly he's critical of the so-called rights of man, liberty, equality, property, and security, but not because they are rights, but because they exist, right, in a particular social context where they, right, become masters over the rights of the citizen. And what Marx wants to do is to redraw those boundaries, not to abolish them, right? Kolakowski, who I mentioned earlier, thought that Marx wanted this idea of a completely unified polity where a private sphere doesn't exist whatsoever. I think the reason why he does that is because he wants to say that Marx didn't realize that there needs to be a separate protected space for individual self-assertion. But as I'll try to show, Marx did realize that there was such a need, and he did endorse it as well. It becomes most clear in the Grundrisse, not on the Jewish question, because on the Jewish question, the conclusion is basically that human beings must retrieve their social powers, not by projecting those powers onto a state that then dominates them, but to take those powers back from the state, okay, and realize, the freedoms, the concrete freedoms in everyday life as species beings. Still really influenced here by Feuerbach and his idea of the human essence, I think, at this point in his journey. And he also cites, which people tend to ignore, Rousseau's a legislator or lawgiver as exemplifying modern alienation, where the state gives individuals powers that are alien to them, right? And so, of course, that is also a critique of the liberal state right there. But we could talk more about that. I realized, that I'm also constrained for time and I want to have a discussion. So I'm going to proceed in a very quick fashion here. But that's, of course, not the final story on rights in Marx's thought, even though it's often treated as if it were. What I like to do in my work when I approach Marx on rights is to approach this question not as an abstract question, but a question that actually was at stake politically for Marx. On the Jewish question, what was the political stake? Defending the equal rights of Jews when they didn't have those rights. Then in 1848-49, Marx returns to the German territories, and the question of rights is back on the table. And Marx is unambiguously in favor of the very liberal political rights that he's taken to dismiss. So even before that revolution, here's what he had to say about rights. I quote, this is in the Communism of the Rheinischer Beobachter. The proletariat was certainly incapable of showing any interest in the privileges of the estates, but a diet demanding trial by jury, equality before the law, the abolition of the corvée system, freedom of the press, freedom in association, and true representation, a diet having once and for all broken with the past and formulating its demands according to the needs of the present instead of according to the old laws, such a diet could count on the strongest support from the proletariat. This isn't Kant. Well, Kant wouldn't talk about the proletariat in that fashion, just as a side note. They wouldn't even be included as far as representation is concerned. But this is Marx, and here he's making a distinction between old laws and new laws. You could say old rights or privileges and new rights that are won or will be won soon enough, though ultimately failed, by the revolutions of 1848-49. And it's important to track what Marx has to say about rights during this period, when he and Engels returned to the German territories and reestablish the Neue Rheinische organ of democracy, right? So this is why I've included, these the titles of these works, so that it doesn't come as a surprise. All of it has been available in the collected works for some time, but for some reason hasn't been emphasized. Maybe others will enlighten me why that is the case. Okay, so more about the March Revolution of 1848 and the defense of rights in the Neue Rheinische Zeitung. Of course, you could say Marx would be in favor of defending freedom of the press. After all, when you're a journalist, right, the heavy hand of the censor, let alone an authoritarian state, causes a problem, right? So what does he have to say about the relationship between the revolution, the March Revolution, which is a liberal or bourgeois revolution, and rights? Two passages to share. The first I'm going to quote, the second I'm just going to summarize. The revolution, the March Revolution, was constantly directed as much against the absolute monarchy, the supreme political expression of the old society, as against the representative of the estates, who stood for a social system that had long ago been destroyed by modern industry. How then was the idea conceived to allow the United Provincial Diet, the representative of the old society, to dictate laws to the new society, which asserted its rights through the revolution. Notice Marx isn't shy about using the language of rights here. And there is a connection being made between old rights and new rights, between old laws and new laws, between the revolution and the new catalog of rights that he wants to defend. And of course, he was also worried about what a counter-revolution or a reactionary return would mean in that context. And unfortunately, that's what happened in the culmination of these revolutions. So he tried to explain and to argue vociferously for a free press, precisely because it could hold the bureaucracy and the authorities in check. Again, it's fascinating that most of us haven't been as familiar with these passages. My version of events is that the Cold War has really colored how we interpret Marx, as if Marx is an enemy of the so-called liberal political rights and civil liberties. He's not. If anything, he was perhaps more consistent in defending these rights than many liberal activists and theorists were. And of course, things don't always go one's way. And even though Marx was unambiguously in favor of these revolutions, the 1848 revolution in the German territories, and even argued for collaboration with the liberal bourgeoisie up until the point that he was willing to betray the revolutionary ideals and goals, right? He found himself on the receiving end of this reactionary turn and was actually on trial. He and the editorial collective of the Neue Rheinische Zeitung. And again, what is being argued here is that there's a need to evaluate the discourse of rights in its context. Okay, so here, for example, it says, well, what happens if there's a tension or a contradiction between the laws, right, and a new stage of social development, a new society being formed? Well, he says, if existing laws enter into open contradiction to a newly achieved stage of social development, then it is up to you, gentlemen of the jury, it was a jury trial, to come between the dead behests of the law and the living demands of society. It is up to you then to anticipate legislation until it knows how to comply with social needs. So now we have a connection between legislation and social needs. It's not fixed, it changes. In the present case, gentlemen, this task is facilitated for you by the letter of the law itself. You have only to interpret it in the sense of our time, our political rights, and our social needs. Now, of course, I'm anticipating an objection. Marx, it's in his interest to defend his rights because he's on trial. And indeed, his legal training helped him get an acquittal. Does that mean that everything that he has written here is purely strategic and instrumental? Not at all, as far as I'm concerned. It's perfectly compatible with his materialist conception of history, if you want to call it that. What needs to be emphasized here is that laws change, rights change, the catalogs change with changing material conditions of life. And if we don't notice this part, we will fall into the same traps of these other interpreters who, for one reason or another, ignored these important, I think, discussions of rights when they were actually at stake, not as theoretical questions, but as practical political questions that mattered to Marx and to Engels during the period of revolution. And so in the end, what Marx and Engels really wanted to emphasize during these revolutionary upheavals, notwithstanding their failures, is that there needs to be a struggle for democracy in the democratic republic and a new catalog of rights, precisely because it will lead to the expansion of the human emancipation that Marx called for in 1843 and 1844, before he was a Marxist, quote unquote. So in one passage I have here, this is all from the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, that the best form of polity is that in which the social contradictions are not blurred, not arbitrarily, that is merely critically and therefore only seemingly kept down. The best form of polity is that in which these contradictions reach a stage of open struggle in the course of which they are resolved. So in 1848-49, Marx thought that the liberal revolution would actually open up a space for the working class. And the working class would grow in its composition, become the majority, and eventually win the battle of democracy and address the social question, which for him and for Engels was integral for the realization of human emancipation. That has to do with property relations and the means of production in particular. But in case you don't believe Marx in that period Engels made sure to repeat what he and Marx were up to in 1892 after Marx had died. And here's what he says to clear any confusion. Marx and I, for 40 years, repeated ad nauseum that for us, a democratic republic is the only political form in which the struggle between the working class and the capitalist class can first be universalized and then culminate in the decisive victory of the proletariat. Now, maybe that victory hasn't been so decisive, but what's important here from Engels' quote, or the passage here, is that they were committed to the idea of the democratic republic, including the catalog of rights that are crucial, that would be crucial to such a republic, because it opens up a space for that struggle. It pushes the horizon and makes possible a new horizon, a broader horizon, and not the end of horizons as such, which is what many interpreters of Marx and human rights seem to attribute to him. Which brings me to liberal justice, or bourgeois justice, if you don't want to call it that. I think it's a double-edged sword. Why is it a double-edged sword? Well, if we think about formal bourgeois right, the idea of equality before the law, or being granted rights in a liberal state, what we see here is the presupposition of emancipation or freedom from direct domination. You're a rights bearer. You can't be enslaved or reduced to a thing, formally. Formally inscribed privileges at the level of the state have been abolished. We can see that as early as on the Jewish question. Now, there's a familiar refrain or critique from the Marxists and the radicals, but that's just a mere form that is blind to empirically relevant inequalities. Anatole France says that the rich and poor are both formally prohibited, right, from sleeping under bridges and the like. But here's my rejoinder to that. Without form, there cannot be a richer content, because form and content are actually connected in Hegel and also in Marx. They can't simply be separated in this, analytical manner. So liberal justice is a double-edged sword. And this becomes clear if we take seriously Marx's Grundrisse and what he has to say about the juridical person there, about the connection between forms of production and legal relations. Here he is very un-Pashukanian, in fact, in my view. He says in the Grundrisse that every form of production, I quote, creates its own legal relations, including the communist one, if we think through the logical argument here to its conclusion. Every form of production creates its own legal relations, including its catalog of rights, forms of government, I should say here. In bringing things which are organically related, forms of production, legal relations, into an accidental relation, into a merely reflective connection, they, bourgeois economists, display their crudity and lack of conceptual understanding. So Marx thought that there is this intricate connection between forms of production and legal relations. But that doesn't mean that domination doesn't exist in societies that claim to be constitutional democracies. Quite the contrary, he continues. All the bourgeois economists are aware of is that production can be carried on better under the modern police on the principle of might makes right. They forget only that this principle is also a legal relation and that the right of the stronger prevails in their constitutional republics as well, only in another form. Here Marx is able to recognize the relationship between forms of production, legal relations, but also how domination continues to exist in a democratic republic to which he was committed, as we saw, right? But the point isn't to get rid of the constitutional republic as such, but to push it to its logical conclusion, if we're interested in human emancipation. And of course, this is what ends up happening in the Grundrisse, that he thinks, just as he says on the Jewish question, that political emancipation represents great progress, so does capitalism and the democratic republic. It's not the final end of the story, but it is an important precondition for it. This passage in the Grundrisse, I don't interpret teleologically or in a stages fashion. I think what he's getting at here is what is required for the full development of the human individual person. And it gives us a sense of this journey from relations of personal dependence when the individual is, we can't even speak of an individual as entirely submerged by the political community. That's what Kolakowski attributes to Marx as account of communism, that there's no separate sphere for the individual to assert themselves. Well, Marx was very aware of that and critical of it too. Then there is another stage he calls objective dependence, the capitalist stage, where we're all bearers of rights, but dependent on impersonal market forces that weigh on us, right? But that is important too, because we separate from the political community. We become individuated. And that's a precondition for free individuality, this assertion that Kolakowski thought was entirely missing in Marx's framework. Free individuality, based on the universal development of individuals and on their subordination of their communal social productivity as their social wealth, is the third stage. The second stage, capitalism, we could say, creates the conditions for the third. And why is that important? Because capitalism produces these developed exchange relations that allow us to individuate. Hegel's philosophy of right, abstract right, which he takes from Kant, right? Be a person and treat others as persons. Nothing more, of course, but Marx wants to go beyond that. In order to go beyond that, we have to first of all achieve that. But it is kind of odd to say, let's achieve juridical personhood and then just chuck it, throw it into the garbage when we get to communism, which is supposed to be all about free individuality. But again, look at debate about that. I'm just showing you that there are resources here, which for one reason or another have been buried under the surface. But since we're in a capitalist society and not in this society of free individuality, I like to think of thinking through Marx in a way that's still pertinent to our own time. Okay, and that's why I agree with thinkers like Ben Said, with Marx, that we have to talk about an antinomy of rights, not right versus no right, but rather right against right. That is the more constructive approach in a capitalist society or capitalist societies today. If we think back to Marx's really early writings, the debates, reflections on the debates on the law of thefts of wood, what is the nature of the antinomy there? Well, here we have a conflict between the customary rights of the poor, the right of necessity to gather fallen forest wood, which was criminalized by the Prussian state, versus the right of private property to make that criminal, theft. So here we have an example of right against right. Who will prevail? That's a political question, not a juridical one. Then there is another one where we see Marx in the class struggles in France. He talks about the right to work. Again, using the language of right. The right to work, he tells us, is in the bourgeois sense an absurdity, a miserable, pious wish. But behind the right to work stands the power over capital. Behind the power over capital, the appropriation of the means of production, their subjection to the associated working class, and therefore the abolition of wage labor, of capital, and of their mutual relations. Notice right and these other more demanding goals are not in conflict. They hide behind this seemingly pious wish. So the goal should be to push these pious wishes in a bourgeois sense beyond being pious wishes and making them a real. So that's one example. But the better example, of course, pertains to Marx's discussion of the working day in Capital, where this emphasis on the antinomy of right against right is also made clear. So he says, and here I have in bold, there is here therefore an antinomy, right against right, both bearing, equally bearing the seal of the law of exchanges, which for Pashukanis was everything about the law. But here's what Pashukanis misses. Between equal rights, force decides. Force decides isn't merely brute force. That's a misinterpretation. He tells us what this means, what this force is. Hence is it that in the history of capitalist production, the determination of what is a working day presents itself as the result of a struggle. That's the force, a struggle between collective capital, the class of capitalists, and collective labor, the working class. If you look earlier in the paragraph, he says, it tells us about what the nature of the struggle is about. So both of them are equal as far as the law is concerned. The capitalist maintains his right as a purchaser, wants to make the length of the day, working day as long as possible, squeeze out as much as possible. What about the worker? The laborer maintains his right as seller when he wishes to reduce the working day to one of definite normal duration. Both of them are equal before the law, but that doesn't mean the law is useless. The law is also, an arena for struggle and contestation. And which form of right will prevail is a political question. That's where the class struggle and just struggle in general comes in. That too seems to be missed when we read into this passage dismissal of rights as the Eden, right? He talks about the Eden of the rights of man. But really the point is to show that the real advances that will be made through class struggle. That is what will color the content of right, the future of right. Which brings me closer to my conclusion, because I should be getting there. The goal, I think, should be to think through the free development of each, to which Marx was committed in the Communist Manifesto and elsewhere. In the critique of the Gotha program, which is also often invoked as evidence that Marx was simply dismissive of right and rights, he says, right is recht, can never be higher than the economic structure of society and its cultural development condition thereby. This is not to say that there won't be a sense of right in society beyond capitalism, but that it'll be a different conception of right, to which different rights will be relevant. And so while right is always the product of a given mode of production or form of production, the value of freedom is realized to a greater or lesser extent across these different forms of production. Freedom has transhistorical value for Marx and is not relative. That's what enables him to say, for example, that capitalism is an advance. And in that sense, that this future communist society would be an advance over the cap without being teleological, because the basis is freedom, the extent to which it's realized. Right and rights are also institutional forms of mediation that under transformed material and social circumstances enable the free development of each to be achieved in a manner that is consistent with the free development of all. That's not just for Kant. For Kant, it's all about coercion. For Marx, it's about how I can ensure that my project is compossible with your project if we're to be free as associated producers in this future society. And so in the end, what I try to do in my work is to push against the conventional grain, these interpretations that have buried valuable resources in Marx for the human rights project. And I'm not going to get into significant detail here, but I just want to focus on the last point, namely that beyond the narrow horizon of bourgeois right, this is from the critique of the Gotha program, lies a broader horizon of right and not the transcendence of right as such. Now, why is this important? Because the vast majority of the interpreters and the commentators who I've cited in the opening parts of the presentation, they interpret Marx in this really fixed way. Rights don't change. Either you have the circumstances of justice or you don't. But Marx didn't interpret things this way. He talks about society, even this future communist society, right, finding itself sort of fully immersed in these bourgeois pangs, right, from which it emerges. Because we're talking about society and social contradictions that can't be erased overnight. It's a transformative process that takes place. But beyond the narrow horizon of bourgeois right must be another horizon, right, of right, and not the end of right as such. And I think this is important interpretively. I also think it's important for the human rights project when we talk about the different catalog of rights, different wave of rights, and what Marxists, since Marx, have to offer to this project. And I'd like to conclude with this caricature, if you will, or cartoon, specifically applying it to the debate about Marxism and human rights and the challenge of exercising Marxist specter in this regard. So of course, we know, as I mentioned before, the legacy of the Cold War, there was a sense of triumphalism. Francis Fukuyama captured it well in his essay and then in his book, which is off-cited. Now he may have a bit of a different interpretation, but that doesn't matter for the purposes of my presentation. What you see here is Marx coming from the side, the margins of the curtain, a play which presents the end of history of capitalism triumphant, including the neoliberal rights, right, against other kinds of rights, which hopefully we'll talk about shortly. And he was supposed to be written out of this play. What is this play? This is a play where neoliberalism reigns supreme, triumphant. But the problem is that Marx can't be written out of this play because he still remains perhaps the most powerful analyst of capitalist society, even in its financialized form. We can find helpful clues. And if that's the case, if we're still living in capitalist society, Marx is going to be valuable not only to the analysis of that society, to the critique of that society, but also what is valuable and what is freedom denying about such a society or social relations. And I think in this respect, if we are open to excavating resources in Marx, those resources are available and may push the horizon of human rights to other horizons with which we may not be familiar, but to which we should continue to think about and to strive for in a society that is vastly unequal and is still rooted in domination. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Igor, for this engaging and interesting talk. And also, of course, I really want to thank you for your book, which is a really extraordinary read, and I can recommend it to all of you. Thus, now Jessica Whyte will offer her comments. And Jessica, perhaps you could indicate if we still have time. I mean, we have like 40 minutes until the break, formally at least. Of course, we could take a little bit longer break, I think, since we started earlier. But if you could indicate it when you're running out of questions, and then we could invite the other panelists also. Yeah, so please, Jessica.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much. And thank you, Igor, for that fantastic paper. I'm hearing it for the first time here. So these thoughts will be sort of me gathering my own thoughts. It's very rich, very provocative talk as well. So what I'm going to say is certainly not going to be the final word, but it's going to be an attempt to pose some questions, to raise some comments about where what you're saying intersects with my own work, and hopefully to foster a broader discussion from here on in. So I thought what you presented here was very compelling and really fascinating. And I thought that it was particularly important in the current context where it seems to me, and I think that this is the point in many ways of this symposium, that we're seeing a real shift in human rights today. And when I say a shift in human rights, I mean a shift in the kind of political priorities that are being taken up by human rights activists, but also by mainstream human rights organizations and even by major states. So my own work has been focused on what I call neoliberal human rights, which are a form of human rights that I suggest were developed over a long period of time by neoliberal thinkers going back to the really late 30s and 1940s, but that came to prominence from the 1970s onwards, and that aligned the protection of human rights very explicitly with the defense of a market order. So this was a conception that was promoted by numerous thinkers associated with the neoliberal Mont Pelerin Society, notably Friedrich Hayek, who, for instance, criticized the Universal Declaration of Human Rights for, as he put it, muddling the classical good rights of the liberal tradition with supposedly rights taken from the Marxist Russian Revolution, in his words. And I'd actually like to go back to that because I think that that's a mischaracterization of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as well as having political problems. So we've seen that period of neoliberals promoting an idea that if you want human rights, the only society that will secure human rights is a free market society. And so those who are committed to human rights must also be committed to defending the competitive market. And I argue in the book that that kind of idea was taken up and assimilated by many major human rights NGOs. In some cases, this was done very explicitly. So I have a case study of Médecins Sans Frontières, for example, which in the mid-1980s explicitly campaigned against post-colonial demands for a new international economic order, argued in favor of a liberal economic order as the only one that would secure human rights against authoritarian post-colonial states, and explicitly worked with Lord Peter Bower, the most important neoliberal development theorist, to combat third worldist demands for economic redistribution. So in some cases, this link was really explicit. In others, it was much more that this was an idea that was sort of in the air. And I think many human rights NGOs simply accepted a sort of neoliberal dichotomy between politics on the one hand as violent and coercive, and civil society on the other as this realm of distributed private power that was non-coercive, mutually beneficial. So that kind of idea, I think, was taken up by many human rights defenders. Whereas I think now what we're seeing is that over quite a long period of time now, and certainly ramping up in the wake of the global financial crisis, many human rights NGOs have turned their attention much more explicitly to social and economic rights, and also to questions of inequality, of economic inequality in particular. And so we're seeing a real push amongst human rights NGOs to actually think about the very dire consequences of economic inequality, both for social and economic rights, but also, interestingly, even for people's ability to realise their civil and political rights, their rights to a fair trial, their rights to procedural justice, etc., and the way that economic inequality deprives people of those kind of rights. So I think in this context, this is a long precursor to saying, I think in this context, rethinking the relationship between capitalism and human rights and returning to Marx's critique of rights is really important. And I think that the way that you've done it is a really sensitive and interesting way to think about the question of Marx and his relation to human rights. Now, I have lots of sort of broad areas of agreement with what you say about Marx on rights specifically. And I'm not a Marx scholar. I'm interested in Marx and his account of rights, but I'm not a sort of someone who devotes my intellectual life to reading Marx. So these comments are going to be, you know, take them in that spirit. But I very much agree with you about Marx's on the Jewish question, and that his central goal was actually one of defending equal rights for Jews. And I'm often struck by the fact that Marx was arguing against Bauer's position that Jews would have to abandon being Jews if they wanted equal rights, and that this position that Marx was arguing against is often attributed to Marx, as though he was in fact making Bauer's argument as opposed to criticizing Bauer's argument. So I really agree with you there. I also agree with you that Marx argued that political emancipation was a step on the way to human emancipation, even if it was not yet human emancipation. And I also agree with you that Marx, throughout his life, but obviously particularly in those early periods that you looked at, was very much interested in questions of law and questions of rights, the rights of the working class. And the question of the law on wood, collecting wood, is a really obvious example, and a really, I mean, obvious in the sense of, like, you raise it and it's a really important and striking example. But I think that often Marx made these kind of arguments against feudal privileges, against absolute monarchy, and in favour of the kind of rights that we associate with the liberal tradition. So I agree with all of this, and also with the idea that Marx saw democratic rights in particular as opening up a space for working class struggle, and that he certainly did not want to close down that space. He saw that space as a really important space. So all that I agree with. Where I think there's perhaps disagreement, and certainly where I would want to pose questions and hear more about your conception here, is partly in the way you mentioned that on the Jewish question, Marx directs his criticisms at the rights of man specifically, but he, you said, leaves political rights unscathed. And to a certain extent, I think that that's right. Certainly he focuses on the rights of man, the liberty, security, equality, and property. But I think that, am I correct in understanding that you're suggesting that these political rights do, in fact, not just that he leaves them unscathed in this text, but that they do remain unscathed by his broader critique of the rights of man? Because the way I read it is that, in fact, the problem is the separation between political rights on the one hand and the rights of man on the other, or between the citizen and the egoistic individual of civil society. And so while he doesn't direct his criticisms at political rights, his point that these political rights become a mere means to the defence of the egoistic rights of the man of civil society suggests a weakness in political rights under capitalism also. And so as I read him, this separation remains a problem. So I'm skeptical of what you say about Marx still defending this idea of a private protected private realm. And I wonder if you could say more about how you understand that protected private realm. Who does the protecting, firstly? Does the private realm assume that there is a distinction between the private and the public? It seems to me that Marx wants to challenge that distinction, and with it, the distinction between civil society and the state. So this is sort of a request for you to talk more about that element of it. You also talked about the intimate connection between forms of production on the one hand and legal relations on the other. So for me, this raises the question of why, if this were the case, would the legal relations of a capitalist society subsist in a post-capitalist form of production? You seem to be suggesting that rights, which as I understand them are the form, in their particular form, are the political form of a capitalist society. Why would these rights remain in a very different form of society? And you sort of made the reference to how Marx saw the achievement of legal personhood as necessary to transcending it. But you then said, but why would we achieve this legal personhood only to throw it away again? But it seems to me that if we accept this kind of account of Marx, that there were preconditions to communism that needed to be achieved in order to build on them, then capitalism also falls into that criteria. That capitalism, in his view, according to some interpretations, and this is a topic of big debate, needed to be achieved in order to be transcended. But obviously that didn't mean that Marx would say, well, we've achieved capitalism now, why would we just throw it away? Obviously he did think that it would be achieved and that achievement would make possible certain other developments, notably that this would make possible the existence of a proletariat that had the capacity to transcend capitalism, but nonetheless, he did wish to transcend it in the interests of something else. And it seems to me that something similar is true of his account of rights. So maybe we could talk about that also. Then I guess I have a couple of more sort of general questions. One is simply about the difference between the question of rights today and the question of rights at the time that Marx was writing. I mean, Marx is writing in a context where, you know, feudal forms of privilege are still very much present, where property doesn't necessarily take the form of individual private property or even capitalist property strictly, that landed property is still very important. So it seems to me that the revolutionary thrust of the rights of man still subsists at the time that Marx is writing, whereas it seems to me that our human rights today look very different to the rights of man of the modern revolutions. And that's so in many different ways. But one of them, I think, is I wondered if you could talk about the relationship between rights and the state, and particularly between rights and the nation state, because it seems to me that Marx is presupposing a context of emancipation within the bounds of the state. That was certainly the question on the Jewish question, whereas it seems to me that human rights today have largely attempted to liberate themselves from that container of the nation state. So if you think of Hannah Arendt's famous criticism of human rights or of the rights of man, that those who only have the rights of man turn out not to have rights at all because they don't belong to a nation state or to a political community that could guarantee those rights. It seems to me that in the period since then, human rights as an international discourse and human rights NGOs have sought to overcome that reliance of human rights on a national political community or on a nation state, and have sought ways to defend and valorize human rights across borders. And things like humanitarian intervention and the responsibility to protect are the starkest examples of that attempt to guarantee rights across borders. But it does seem to me that that's a shift from even when Arendt was writing, but certainly a shift from the kind of understanding of human rights that Marx was criticizing in the form of modern rights declarations. So I'd just like you to talk a little bit more about that distinction between contemporary human rights on the one hand and the rights of man, and whether that shift does anything for how we understand Marx's critique. And then the other one finally was just to take up this question of the Cold War. So you mentioned, and I think it's absolutely true, that contemporary understandings of Marx are completely overdetermined by the Cold War, and that we read Marx through the experience of the Soviet Union, through the Cold War, through the gulags. And I think that it's perhaps now becoming possible, certainly for my students, it's becoming possible to revisit Marx without the complete overdetermination of the Cold War. But I just wanted to raise something in relation to the Soviet Union and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and sort of ask about how it relates to what you're saying there, because there's a standard position, we read it everywhere, that the sort of liberal free world defended civil and political rights, and the Soviet Union was interested in social and economic rights. And I went back and did a lot of work on the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it became clear to me that this was simply not true at all. Firstly, the Soviets actually had very little interest in the social and economic rights. They supported them. They said, yeah, sure, we'll vote in favor of them, but they certainly didn't push them. And they were profoundly, they said things like, what's the use of declaring that there's an equal right to work where some people work all the time and others, you know, get to live off their labor? No declaration of rights is actually going to achieve economic transformation. So you could basically, it seems to me their attitude was, sure, you can write that down on your piece of paper, but it will be, in the pejorative sense, mere form, scraps of paper, not particularly relevant. On the other hand, they were deeply interested in non-discrimination. And some people would cast this as being simply cynical because they could show up Jim Crow in the United States. But I think there was much more to it than this. I think that the reason that the Soviets participated, and participated so enthusiastically in the drafting of the Universal Declaration, even though they ultimately abstained in the UN, was because they believed that human rights were necessary to forestall the return of fascism. And they saw fascism as an attempt to go back to feudalism, to undo the gains of the bourgeois revolutions, and to strip people of the rights that those revolutions had brought about. So they pushed very, very hard for all of the rights to the sort of anti-discrimination provisions, rights to formal equality, not to substantive equality. And that really was the Soviet contribution to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We probably wouldn't have had all of those very strong language about non-discrimination on the basis of race in particular, if not for the Soviet contribution. So I just wondered how that fits in your position, because I've discussed it with sort of various people who work on Marx, and particularly there's a scholar, Lars Lee, who's done a lot of work on Lenin in particular, and he's very interested in the question of political rights and political inequality and equality. And his argument is that in the pre-sort of Stalinist period of the Soviet Union, that actually the mainstream of social democracy, as in the tradition leading from Marx, was one which absolutely stressed the importance of political rights and political liberties, and that was for a very long time considered to be the Marxist position. And according to what you're saying, this would be consistent with Marx's own position, and that the turn against rights internally in the Soviet Union was in that sense a real turn away from what had previously been the mainstream Marxist position. So I think that there's probably more than enough for you to respond to in that, and I'd like to give opportunity for others to speak also. So I might leave it there, but just say thank you for an excellent paper, and I really look forward to more discussion and engagement.
Thank you very much. So I respond now, right? Just wanted to make sure. Okay. All right. Well, one thing I want to note is that I am, I've read your book and also assigned it as a recommended book to my students in courses in political economy. And so I've always been really interested in this kind of idea of neoliberal human rights. And I guess my orientation towards that would be, again, right against right, as opposed to the idea of rights on one hand and no rights on the other. So that would be sort of my approach. But let me try to take your questions, which are very good questions but very tough ones, one step at a time in sequential order, and I'll try to be concise. First, I think you're right that Marx problematizes their separation of political society and civil society. That actually predates the Jewish question. There's Hegel's a critique of Hegel's philosophy, right? The introduction there, he basically takes Hegel's account of the modern state as the best representation of this division, of this alienation, right? So in a way, I agree with you that the nature of that separation or the contradiction between the two is something that Marx finds problematic. And in that sense, right, the fact that political rights, the rights of the citizen, are held captive by, let's call them early neoliberal human rights, contractual rights, and so on. Um, that's what it takes to be most, I think, problematic. That they should be brought together, right? But I think maybe one area of disagreement we may have is that what does this bring back together mean? One way of interpreting that is by saying eviscerate and ultimately annihilate the very idea of a separate sphere. Now, there's different ways of understanding that too. One is to say that there will still be boundaries. People will still have the freedom to have families of their own, right? Not like the guardians in Plato's Republic, right? And so on and so forth. I'm trivializing, but you've also asked me to provide evidence for that, and I will in just a moment. So the idea of retrieving our social powers in everyday life, what I'd like to say is I agree with you that that means the bringing together, you could say, of political society and civil society on a new level or in a new manner, even though here in really early writings, I don't think he has a worked out institutionalized solution. Very Feuerbachian here, because there's an appeal to species being. But what does that mean institutionally? It's still not clear. It's even clear in the economic and philosophic manuscripts, his notes, right, in 1844, where he is clear about what he's opposed to. So the earliest argument for why there should be something like a private sphere that is not in antagonistic relation to the public sphere are those manuscripts. He makes a different distinction between what he calls vulgar or barracks communism and this other kind of communism. So what is the problem with barracks communism? It denies personality. So what is personality? It's this idea that you're a separate self and that you're not simply submerged in the community or the property of some other individual who is the master over you. And what does that recognize as well? Here, I was influenced by the work of Sean Sayers, his account of alienation in Marx, these themes from Marx. And there he also recognizes that a certain understanding of private property has an educative role to play, this individuating role. And when in the economic and philosophic manuscripts, he talks about communism as sort of the reappropriation for a man, right? There's a sense in which there's something that uh, bourgeois private property teaches, right? We could say morally, politically, that will be required in a radically transformed way in a society beyond capitalism. Now, why do I have confidence saying that? Well, because if we turn to Capital, which was his life work, incomplete, okay, but still, his life work, he makes a distinction between what he calls bourgeois or capitalist private property and individual property, individual Eigentum. Now, for those of us who are committed to only one view, that there can only be one conception, right, of property, that is capitalist private property, private ownership of the means of production, this doesn't make any sense. And in fact, that was the view of Düring. And Engels tried to respond to him in anti-Düring, specifically with reference to that passage in Capital. So how can we make sense of individual property as distinct from capitalist private property And how would that be possible without a sphere, a separate sphere where that right would be respected beyond capitalism? So one way of understanding that is that we have to understand what is kind of in the domain, the public domain, and what isn't. If you take the critique of the Gotha program, right, Marx still says that the workers have a right to the articles of consumption, even though the means of production are now socially owned and controlled. But even in the first stage of communist society, early stage of communist society, the workers get back, right, based on what they have contributed in their labor, which is measured by time or something along those lines. Now, in this future society, beyond the first stage, what you have is the distribution according to need, right? And that too is kind of very vague in that sense, and we don't know, and I don't think he knew what it would look like institutionally per se. But there's a sense in which those things will be freely available for people to consume as theirs. They wouldn't have to claim it as much. They wouldn't have to clamor for the rights, but that doesn't rule out the idea of rights, or that there will be a sphere for individual property, which is distinct from crude communism, which hasn't even arrived at the bourgeois sense. And some argue that the Soviet model, at a certain point in time, ended up embodying vulgar, crude communism precisely because it tried to do away with individual differences. I don't think even in the Soviet model it's particularly accurate a claim, but I'm using this as an example, as often is the case. But if we take even the critique of the Gotha program, why does Marx think that the first stage is defective, which he still calls bourgeois? Well, the reason is because of this formality that is blind. The abstract formality is blind to the concrete differences between human beings. Now, okay, if you want to honor those concrete differences, there has to be a way in which their concrete differences are protected, safeguarded. By whom? Well, it'll have to be the political community, the associated producers, who will not only have to have collective rights, if you will, to participate politically, because in my view anyway, politics doesn't end with communism. It's not the end of history. It's the beginning of conscious human history, which people like Fukuyama get wrong, but it's in the preface, in that famous preface to the contribution to the critique of political economy. And Engels, as I try to point out in my book, and this is still fragments, in his speeches at Elberfeld, says that there may still be conflicts, reduced conflicts in this communist society of the future, and they will easily be resolved by arbitrators. Now, okay, so this is not very convincing, especially in a complex society. Let's acknowledge, okay, but then even if there are arbitrators, that means there has to be a standard to arbitrate, right? Now, if there's a standard to arbitrate, it means people are entitled to certain things. They have certain expectations. We don't have to call that rights, but then the challenge is, what is that if not a standard of right and rights, even if they'll be easily resolved by arbitrators? And I think he was too speedy and rather utopian in that expectation. But you know, we all have wishful thinking moments. Engels had a lot of those, as did Marx. But I think where they were more realistic is that the change wouldn't happen overnight, and that we would inherit the pangs, the birthmarks of capitalist society. So that's for the first one. That I think the only disagreement really there is that uh, what was meant by this kind of bringing together and pushing against this alienation or separation. I don't think it rules out this private sphere if it's no longer understood as capitalist private property. It's understood as individual property, for example, and politics doesn't end, it continues. And now it's actually possible in a meaningful sense, because how else will the associated producers rationally govern their interchange with nature and with each other? That's a quote from Capital, in a manner worthy of their human nature. So as for the second question, the connection between forms of production and legal relations, why would legal relations, right? So this connection, and maybe I should clarify that first. So that I get from Marx, not in this deterministic, kind of causally deterministic fashion, but that a mistake that bourgeois economists, we could say legal theorists make, is they think that somehow we can simply separate, right, the legal sphere from the political economy, if you want to call it that. That's a mistake that they make, because they could say the law can do everything, but we have to keep, you know, private property intact, because that's the fulcrum of civilization or something like that, right? And of course, spontaneous market order and Hayek is just that. It's precisely that argument. And in a way, Marx anticipates the critique of Hayek when he makes those claims about crude bourgeois economists. Now, I think the challenge here is why then would any kind of catalog of rights obtain in a society beyond capitalism? So I try, because there, he didn't really write about this stuff. He didn't want to write the recipes for the cookshops of the future, even though it doesn't excuse him entirely because he was a philosopher as well. But for the sake of argument, I think the best way of approaching him is conceptually. So what does this idea of every form of production creates its own legal relations? What does it commit him to, theoretically? Or in the critique of the Gotha program, right can never be higher than the economic structure of society and its cultural development conditioned thereby. It means that the communist society of the future, what is clear, it'll have a standard of right. It will have rights, which will be enforced by the arbitrators or the associated producers. It will be radically different from anything that we've grown accustomed to, but it will also inherit the positive gains made by bourgeois or capitalist society. But I think something has to go, right? And what has to go, and it's certain, it's capitalist private property has to go, understood as private ownership of the means of production. But there has to be something else that takes its place. Not nothing, not nihilism, right? And that something else has to be individual property, social ownership of the means of production, which is different from nationalization, which is simply status, because you could nationalize and not socialize. That's an important distinction that people like Michael Leibowitz make, and I think they're quite spot on with that. So maybe it's a question of the baby and the bathwater again. Something gets preserved and other things will have to get negated. But the word I use is superseded, not transcended, because transcended means being left behind. At least that's how I understand the word. And it's convenient for most interpreters to use that word. But if every form of production creates its own legal relations, then different legal relations will have to obtain under different forms of production. But I can't paint it for you in advance. This is the challenge I always have, because that's a political battle. That's where the right against right comes back in, right? Who will determine the content and the form of right? Well, the people who are fighting for a different, an alternative to neoliberal human rights, to bring it back to the present, which is what I think is most valuable in the Marxian framework. That this you can find in Ben Said. I want to put in another plug for the recent translation in The Dispossessed. It's spot on there. It's really important. And also early on in the work of E.P. Thompson, right? That the legal arena is an arena for struggle, not over right and no right, but rather over a different conception of property. Those have changed. I agree with you. Those have changed, and we can't simply assume that when Marx was writing, his approach to rights is the same as our own. But there are certain similarities in terms of basic foundations, even though the form has evolved and has changed. In fact, Marx in the Grundrisse, and this Pashukanis likes, says we can even find the form in Roman law, right? So how come we could find the form in Roman private law, and we continue to latch onto these categories in liberal private law, but they have really evolved to the point where we can talk about intellectual property, which is a big problem, patents, right? Think about the vaccine nationalism, vaccine imperialism, whatever you wish to call it, but the root of them is still there. And so I think in that sense, what we should take from Marx are those roots, right? And what in those roots is worth preserving and what is worth negating and ultimately superseding. But that's not, at this point, I think Marx can't help us, because those struggles will be contemporary struggles over the language of rights, and ultimately are political, not juridical, in my view. So here I sort of agree with you and also with Sam Moyn. But I think Sam Moyn, the issue there is he wants to claim that Marxism is deterministic with respect to, the link between human rights and neoliberalism, where Marxism is a broad, diverse camp, right? You'll find every version if you look for it. Which brings me to the question of the nation state. Well, first I want to say that although we can debate this, it's not Hannah Arendt. The right to have rights presupposes that someone will still be able to enforce the right. So who will enforce the right for Hannah Arendt? The problem with the rights of man, right, is also the dissolution of these empires, right? And that you find people who whose rights cannot be enforced. They don't even have the basis on which they can claim
Yeah.
those rights. So it's sort of like a chicken and egg thing here, in a very tragic and brutal, its legacy in any case, that people find themselves in these positions where they don't have a state that will protect them. But here actually, I actually take most of my instruction from On the Jewish Question. That on the Jewish question, ultimately, yes, it works within the framework of the nation state because that's Bauer who he's responding to. And he takes the most developed version of that, the United States, but not all of the states, because we know slavery was the progressive states, he says, of America. But ultimately, the lesson for me of On the Jewish Question with respect to human emancipation is that you can have a state that'll tell you that you're a rights bearer and still be unfree. That's the lesson of On the Jewish Question, that mere rights are not enough, because those rights can also be taken away as they were, with respect to the Jewish community, the Holocaust, one thinks the Roma, communists, and so on and so forth. Lots of people had rights and then lost those rights. They were de-emancipated. So I think the lesson of On the Jewish Question, the best lesson that can be taken from it, is that rights not enough, right? To refer back to Sam Moyn's book, but are important for anything more expansive. Um, but I think here the most that we should learn as far as going beyond the nation state are the experiments, right? In the International Working Men's Association. There too, this idea of protecting or safeguarding against discrimination was also very important for Marx. And it's here in this context that he again is really worried about the things that would seem to us to be trivial, but he was worried about these issues of discrimination, right? And also the right of nation self-determination, for example, not an abstract internationalism, but a concrete internationalism that is still working within the framework of nation states. So we could say, for example, that today's human rights regime is very critical of the nation state, but the nation state, has come back with a vengeance in a very problematic way, we could say. So maybe we should debate about this. I'm not an expert on the nation state and the international human rights order, but I think, even if the human rights framework, at least the progressive one, is critical of the nation state, we can't assume that the nation states, will become obsolete. That used to be a thing, but I think that thesis has been refuted, unfortunately, with contemporary reality. And so then the question is, what would a concrete internationalism look like, and where do human rights fit in? I think that's important. I also should put in a plug for those who are interested. There's a conference on Marxism and nationalism happening on June 5th at the Marx and Philosophy Society, so tune into that. But I think the discussion has to become focused on this question of internationalism, the extent to which Marxist internationalism is similar to, but also very different from liberal cosmopolitanism vis-a-vis the question of rights, and whether or not this kind of revolution that is hoped for can be global, and how that would unfold. I think these are really difficult questions to which I don't have answers, unfortunately, yet, or maybe not anytime soon. In any case, now the Cold War. So I've managed to read. Thank you for making that chapter available. I think on Academia, where you talk about 1917. So I managed to read a little bit in preparation. Now I tend to focus on 1917 early years of the Russian Revolution, rather than the Declaration of, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But there, what we do see is the advent, at least a commitment to the defense of social rights as well in those early years. And Quigley, I know you're critical of Quigley, but Quigley is right to point out that some of the achievements of the Russian Revolution weren't seen in Western liberal democracy until much later. Of course, that came to an end rather quickly when Stalin really consolidated his power. I'm also thinking of rights to abortion, for example. We should call it a social economic right as well, which is under attack again. All right, that was overturned in the Soviet Union. So it's important, I think, here to look at what Marx has to say about rights not being fixed, but being subject to change in light of changing circumstances. Why can't that apply to the Soviet Union as well in a rather tragic way? So there were certain achievements that weren't seen in the welfare states of liberal democratic welfare states until much later. So nothing is guaranteed, which is why politics, I think, is so crucial, as it was in the Soviet Union, as it is for us today, in a global world, fighting a pandemic and tons of injustice and domination.
Igor,
There is some.
I'm sorry, but we now have 5 minutes break until the next section. No signs that you're very early in the morning in Canada. But in fact, you will have the chance tomorrow in the concluding discussion to relate to the questions again. And of course, Jessica, you will also be able to pose new questions then. So I would like to thank you very much, Igor, and also Jessica, for this wonderful discussion.